Next Sunday is October the 31st. And in addition to being the last day of October, it is also Halloween. So I dug back in the archives of my past lessons, and I pulled a lesson out that I originally taught 11 years ago. And in this lesson, we looked at how Christians should react to a holiday that's so closely related to the occult. Now, I want to begin by asking you a question, and raise your hand. How many of you ever dressed up in a costume on October 31st and then went out canvassing the neighborhood for candy by knocking on every door you could come to? Yes, okay. How many of you thought it was fun?
Yes. Great.
Well, you're not alone. Halloween has become the second most popular holiday in America today. The only holiday that's more popular than Halloween is Christmas. 50% of all American households are going to decorate their homes for Halloween, and 80% decorate them for Christmas. But this holiday goes much deeper than simply a fun night out for the kids. Among adults, Halloween has become the third most popular reason to throw a party. It's right there behind New Year's Eve and the Super Bowl Sunday. 1 out of every 3 adults will buy a costume for themselves as well as for their kids, and a lot of people will even buy a costume for their pets. And I'll bet that you didn't know that October 31st is also National Magic Day. National Magic Day was first established in 1927 by the Society of American Magicians to honor their late president, Harry Houdini, who died on Halloween in 1926. National Magic Day is now a part of the National Magicians Week, which is observed by magicians all over the world. Halloween has also become big business. Advertising Age magazine said that Halloween was enough to scare Santa. The candy industry says that over half of their annual sales come from the purchase of Halloween candy. In fact, Americans will spend nearly $2.6 billion on Halloween candy this year alone. That's about 600 million pounds of candy. That's about 3.5 pounds of trick-or-treat, or the equivalent of 355 Hershey Kisses. 355 billion Hershey Kisses. Halloween is the most candy-intensive holiday of the year. Halloween has become a $10 billion business bonanza for the American businessmen. Well, for centuries, the observance of Halloween has stirred up questions in the minds of Christians. Is it right for a Christian to participate in the observance of a holiday that is so often associated with the occult? Well, today we're going to make an attempt to get some answers to those questions. First, we're going to look at the history surrounding the origin of Halloween. Then we'll examine some of the customs and the symbolism surrounding the observance of that holiday. And third, we'll look at the biblical principles that apply here. All right, where did Halloween come from? Well, most of the beliefs and customs of Halloween originated with an ancient people called the Celts. These people lived in most of what is now modern-day Great Britain, Ireland, and France. We can trace their culture back to the time 200 years before the birth of Christ. So these people were around hundreds of years before Christianity really made an appearance in Europe. The Celts were a barbaric people, and their religion was steeped in the occult practices and superstitions. They practiced a religion that was presided over by a priestly order known as the Druids. Druidism is one of the many religions known as the mystery religions. They call them that because the secrets of these religions were only known by a very small number of priests. And since that knowledge was never written down, it was always passed on verbally. And as a result, the practices of the Druids varied widely from one area to another. What passed as Druidism in one area may be totally different from the Druidism that was practiced in another area. So there are a lot of things about the Druids that we still can't explain. And as a result, the interpretation of the evidence that is available to us is very often disputed. But even though we aren't absolutely sure how they actually practice the religion from one area to another, the basic tenets of Druidism are the same everywhere that it was practiced. There are people today who call themselves Druids, but the religion that they practice is something they just simply made up. The Druid religion relied heavily on charms and casting spells and just plain superstition. Druidism is what is called an animistic religion. In other words, they worship nature. They believe that all life forms come from one central spiritual source and that every rock, plant, and animal has a soul. To them, even the wind was alive and has a soul. The idea pops up every now and then in a Disney movie when people talk to animals and rocks and trees. And any of you who have ever seen the Disney animated film Pocahontas know exactly what I mean. The main god in animism is Mother Earth or Mother Nature, depending on who you're talking to. And there are animistic religions practiced all over the world today. One of the more famous animists was the singer John Denver. Many environmentalists also hold animistic beliefs, and many animal rights folks do as well. They may not actually subscribe to a formal religion, animistic religion, but they are animistic. They do follow animistic beliefs. It's interesting to point out that over 90% of the mysterious crop circles that we've been hearing about over the years have occurred in the general area of Stonehenge, which is thought to be an ancient Druid ruin. Well, of all the plants in the world, the Druids have given the oak tree and the mistletoe plant great spiritual significance. Lewis Spencer is an expert in Celtic culture, and he says that the term Druid literally means priest of the oak. Since there are so many similarities between the Druid religion and the religion practiced in India, some people feel that the cults originally came from Asia and settled in Europe. Then many of them moved to Great Britain and Ireland. The greatest similarity can be seen in the beliefs in reincarnation. Both the Druids and the Hindus taught that humans could be reincarnated as humans or animals, depending on how they lived their past life. Now, the main Celtic god is Belenus. He was a sun god. He was honored at the festival every year on May 1st called Beltane, which means fire of Bel. Second only to Belenus was the god of death. They think his name was Samhain, but nobody really knows for certain, but just to keep our lives simple as possible, we're going to call him Samhain. The festival to honor Samhain was held on November 1st, and some people think that it was called Samhain. Even so, there are just as many people who think that Samhain was made up by someone who was just trying to come up with a feeble explanation for the origin of the word Halloween. The festival of Beltane, in honor of the sun god, Belenus, was a summer festival. This is why so many Druid structures in the world, like Stonehenge, seem to mark the path of the sun throughout the year. And the festival of Samhain is in honor of the death god, Samhain, was the winter festival. You see, at the beginning of May, winter was over and nature was budding into summer. So what better time of the year to celebrate the sun than the time of the year when the days were growing longer and the temperatures were getting warmer. Then, at the beginning of November, the days were getting shorter, the temperatures were falling, and the leaves were turning brown and falling to the ground as the winter was approaching. So, what better time to celebrate death than in November? These festivals were celebrated by offering sacrifices to their gods, and most often these sacrifices were crops or animals. This was the time to prepare for winter, and the crops were being harvested. So a portion of the crop was offered to the gods in order to guarantee that they would have a better crop the next year. And they would cull their herds by removing any animals that they didn't think would survive through the winter and offer them as sacrifices to the gods. But there is evidence that they would occasionally offer human sacrifices as well. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, the Druids literally covered their altars with the blood of their victims during the festivals. Scores of people would be hoarded into cages and burned alive all at once. They felt that the more the victims suffered, the bigger crops would be the following year. Now, for the most part, only criminals were sacrificed, but if the supply of criminals ran out before the gods seemed to be appeased, innocent victims were also offered as well. They also believed that the way their victims struggled or as they were being killed and how the blood flowed were omens of that foretold the future. The main event of these festivals involved the lighting of huge bonfires. And the word bonfire comes from the words bone fire, which they would stack up the victims and burn them in these fires. In fact, even though the practice of human sacrifice stopped much earlier, the custom of burning human and animal remains in these fires wasn't stopped until around 1600 AD. And after that, they started burning effigies instead. And see, Halloween started out as much more than simply a day when children went out and tried to talk their neighbors into giving them candy. Even today, it's believed that many of the people who are reported missing around Halloween have been used in human sacrifices by modern pagans in order to celebrate the holiday. Some former Satan worshippers have even reported that women in their particular group were often impregnated at a time when they would give birth just before Halloween. Then they would deliver their babies at home, so there was no record of their birth. That way the babies could be offered as human sacrifices to Satan. And since there was no record that the babies ever existed, no one ever missed them, and the authorities would never know about it. But there's no hard evidence that has ever surfaced to verify those claims, so they may not be true. Now, we know that the Celts worshipped about 400 gods, but the god of death, Samhain, seemed to be the one that the Druids paid the most attention to. We also learned from the Julius Caesar's commentaries that the Druids taught that the Celts were descended from the god Dispater. Dispater, who along with Pluto and Hades, was one of the Roman gods of death and the underworld. Now, November 1st was also a significant day for the Druids. That was a day when they celebrated their new year. And they believed that the wall that separated the world of the living from the world of the dead was broken on that night just before the new year began. This allowed the spirits of the people who died that year to roam around the earth for one night. While these spirits were having their final fling on earth, Samhain would gather all the souls of the evil people that had died that year, and he would decide which kind of animal they would be reincarnated as. The souls of the good people were always reincarnated as human beings. So Samhain only had to decide what to do with the evil people. Well, the Druids also believed that by offering sacrifices, prayers, and gifts to Samhain on behalf of their dead friends and relatives, it would be a lesser punishment for them, and that would also allow them to be reincarnated as a better animal or maybe even a human being. Roman Catholics have a similar belief today. They'll offer masses, light candles, pray to the dead, and give money to the church in order to lighten their punishment in purgatory. Unfortunately for them, purgatory was the invention of some long-dead pope in the late 12th century. It was invented as a money-making scheme. You see, the Roman Catholic Church still teaches that giving money to the church will lessen their time of a loved one would spend in purgatory after they die. In other words, you can buy your way into heaven. But if that's true, then why would Jesus need to die on the cross? I mean, we can get into heaven by going to purgatory and working off our own sins. And none of that is found anywhere in the Bible. Remember what Jesus said to the thief on the cross next to him. He said, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Why didn't Jesus tell that man that he had to go to purgatory first to be purified? I mean, was Jesus lying to the man? Besides, Scripture tells us that there is nothing that we could do that would give us salvation. Well, if you can't work your way into heaven when you're here on earth, what makes you think that you can work your way into heaven after you're dead? Now, just as a little bit of trivia here, this is one of the reasons why the Roman Catholic Church wanted to include the apocryphal books in the Bible. You see, some of the books support the idea of purgatory as well as praying for the dead and praying to the dead. They certainly didn't get that idea from the Bible. Neither the Jews or the early church ever considered those books to be Scripture. The Jews studied them back then, just like we would study a book by Billy Graham today. Maybe worth reading, but we don't consider it to be Scripture. Well, some of the families weren't all that interested in having a visit from late Uncle Harry. So they would try to scare away these spirits by lighting huge bonfires on the hilltops. They would do this to fool the spirits into thinking that the sun was coming up and the night was over. These fires were also supposed to protect the sun god from Belenus. Protect the sun god Belenus. So you see, the idea was to make sure that Belenus would stay awake all night. And that way, Samhain wouldn't be able to trap him and make the night last forever. Well, for several days before the new year was to begin, young boys would travel around the neighborhood begging for materials to be burned in these huge fires. And it wasn't that long ago that these fires were still being lit in Scotland. The Scots called them Samnoggins, which shows the Druid influence in that custom. Well, since every family was to build their own bonfire, this developed into a contest between families to see who could build the biggest one. And the Irish celebrated this festival with a whole lot of alcohol. so it turned into a huge drinking party. Well, to help him in his duties, Samhain would also release all of the demons, ghosts, and witches on the day before the new year began. They were to roam the earth all night long, victimizing people. So to protect themselves from the onslaught of these evil spirits, the people would dress up in costumes that made them look like demons, ghosts, and witches themselves. That way, the real demons, witches, and ghosts wouldn't know that they really were human beings and would leave them alone. Well, at the same time that the people were trying to frighten off the evil spirits, they would put out food offerings in order to make sure that the good spirits that were waiting to be reincarnated would feel welcome. Included in the feast would be many sweet treats that were offered to attract the good spirits and appease the bad spirits. Now, some of this happened on the day before the Samhain festival that marked the new year. Fortune-telling became an important part of that religious festival. I mean, after all, this was the last day of the year, so everyone wanted to know what was in store for them for the coming year. In reality, almost everything they did at the festival was for the purpose of seeing into the future. After all, I mean, who wouldn't want to know what the new year had in store for them? So among other things, the Druids believed that they could foretell the future by studying the shapes of various fruits and vegetables. This practice became especially prominent after the Romans moved into Europe and into Great Britain and Ireland between 58 and 51 BC. Over time, the feast for Samhain would become merged with the Roman harvest festival that was held on the same day. The Roman festival honored the goddess Pomona. She was the goddess who was in charge of the fruit of the trees. The Roman festival of Pomona involved the offering of fruits and nuts to the goddess so that she would help them with the following year's crops. Well, Pomona's favorite fruit was supposed to be the apple. The Druids associate the apple with rebirth, so they would bury apples in graves to be food for the dead. Well, this Roman custom fit right into the Druid festival of Samhain because the Druids also considered the apple to be a love charm. So the Roman custom of offering fruit and nuts to Pomona and the Druid custom of using fruit and nuts to foretell the future eventually became merged. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit later. Now, the Samhain celebration was not unique. There are many festivals held all over the world that are supposed to celebrate a time when the dead are thought to return to earth in order to mingle with the living. The Hindus have their night of Holi. The Iroquois Indians celebrate a festival of the dead every 12 years. During their festival, all of the people who died there in the preceding 12 years were honored with prayers. I mean, even today, there is a national holiday in Mexico called Dia de los Muertos, which is Day of the Dead. It begins on November 2nd and is celebrated for 2 days. During this time, death becomes a sort of neighborly figure who appears on candy, jewelry, toys, bread, cakes, and just about anywhere else you can imagine. This is a time when the souls of the dead are supposed to return to earth so that they can be honored. Mexicans will decorate their doors with flowers in order to welcome what they call angelitos. The angelitos are supposed to be the souls of dead children. But even though there are other similar celebrations, the modern celebration of Halloween traces its roots to the Celtic festival of Samhain. Well, as Christianity moved into Europe, it collided head-on with these pagan cultures and their festivals. These pagan holidays were so entrenched in the culture that new converts to Christianity were having a lot of trouble separating themselves from them. I mean, after all, they had celebrated these festivals all their lives. And it's hard to stay away when all of your neighbors are throwing a party. So these pagan festivals were becoming a real stumbling block for their faith. Well, obviously, the Roman Catholic Church of the Middle Ages was opposed to the paganism that was involved in the Samhain festival. So here's what they did. They decided to allow the people to continue to celebrate on those days, but they would give them a Christian reason to do it. So they started to assign distinctively Christian meanings to those days and would directly challenge these pagan holidays. In other words, the church gave them a Christian reason to celebrate that day. And they started with the Pantheon in Rome. The Pantheon was the Roman temple that was dedicated to all of the Roman gods of mythology. Well, on May 13th of the year 609 or 610 AD, Pope Boniface IV decreed that the Roman Pantheon was to be dedicated to the Virgin Mary and all of the Christian martyrs. Then he ordered all Roman Catholics to celebrate this event every year on May 13th. This day became known as All Saints' Day or All Hallows' Day on the Catholic calendar. Well, in an attempt to counteract the influence of the pagan festival of Samhain, Pope Gregory III moved the Roman Catholic holiday from the traditional day of May 13th and told Catholics to celebrate it on November 1st. It was to honor all Christian martyrs. Then, in the following century, Pope Gregory IV expanded All Hallows' Day to include all of the saints who had died, whether they were martyred or not. In addition to that, he made November 2nd All Souls' Day and set it aside as a day to pray for the dead who were still suffering in purgatory, which, like I said earlier, is a waste of time. Well, the day before All Hallows' Day, on October the 31st, started to be called All Hallows' Evening. And in Old English, a poetic contraction of evening is een. So the day became All Souls' Day. The day before All Souls' Day became known as All Hallows-een. Well, voila, it was eventually shortened to the word Halloween. Now, there are other explanations for the origin of the word Halloween, but this one is the one that makes the most sense to me. But if you find a better one you like, go for it. Well, ancient Christians actually detested the celebration of Halloween, and by the 15th century, the church had adopted a policy of punishing anyone who was involved in anything that even resembled a practice of witchcraft. So for the next 200 years, thousands of people were tortured and burned at the stake as witches. And they had an interesting way of getting a conviction. They would accuse a person of witchcraft, then they would torture them until they finally confessed to being a witch, and then they would execute them. Some of them were even in America. Witch trials were especially prominent in the colonies of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Virginia, and I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the Salem witch trials. Because of this, no one would even mention Halloween and much less celebrate it. Okay, so how did Halloween make its way to America? Well, I'm glad you asked. By the 18th century, the practice of burning witches had just about stopped. But even as late as the 19th century, the beliefs and practices surrounding the celebration of Halloween were still flourishing in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and in some parts of England. Now, Halloween isn't particularly English, and it isn't particularly Protestant. And since the early settlers of America were mostly English Protestants, Halloween was not practiced very much in America for the first 200 years. In fact, the Puritan settlers wouldn't have allowed the celebration of anything that even resembled a pagan feast. And that was especially true of one that celebrated the spirit world of witches and demons. In fact, they even outlawed the celebration of the Lord's birth on December 25th because that day used to be the pagan holiday of Saturnalia. So what changed? Well, in the middle of the 19th century, the celebration of Halloween had lost most of its pagan elements. What remained was the party elements of the holiday. And when a large number of Irish Catholics made their way to America in an effort to escape the terrible starvation that swept through Ireland during the potato famine, they brought their Halloween customs into America. It was only after this migration that Halloween became an accepted holiday that was celebrated by Americans. And even then, it was usually limited to small Irish Catholic settlements. So to some degree, our modern celebration of Halloween is actually an Irish custom, and it goes all the way back to the Irish Celts. In fact, Ireland is just one place in the world where Halloween is recognized as a national holiday. Mexico, Italy, and Portugal also celebrate Halloween. Of course, Halloween's popularity in America was also helped along by the revival of the Spiritist movement in 1848. So now that we know how Halloween came to America, let's look at some of the customs and symbols that are associated with Halloween. Since the holiday itself has its roots in paganism, it shouldn't come as any surprise to us that many of the customs and practices that surround this holiday are also related to pagan customs. Over the years, these customs and symbols have been influenced by many things, so the exact origins really aren't always clear. Now, probably the most well-known practice of Halloween is the Halloween costume. For the Celts, putting on masks and other disguises had several purposes. First, it hid the identity so that the marauding spirits wouldn't recognize them as being human beings and would leave them alone. Then, when Christianity came on the scene, the costume was probably used to hide the identity of the person who was participating in this pagan festival. And I'm sure that there were times when a Celt would wear a costume so that they could do some mischief to his neighbor and blame it on the spirits. But the Celts would wear costumes for other reasons as well. The Druid religion was a nature religion, so they would very often put on animal costumes. They did this because they felt that it would give them the strength and characteristics of that animal. Another possible explanation comes out of the Roman Catholic custom of displaying the relics of the saints on All Hallows Day. Since the poorer churches couldn't afford relics, they instituted the custom of having parishioners dress up as these various saints, and then they would parade them through the streets. The rest of the people would then dress up as angels or devils, and they would accompany the procession of the saints. Of course, a big part of Halloween, especially for the kids, is the custom of going door to door, yelling trick or treat, and hopefully getting some candy. Dentists love this part. Well, there are several possible explanations for this custom. First, the Druids thought that witches had to go door to door and steal the things that they needed for their Sabbath festival. So these witches would come to the door and threaten to cast an evil spell on the household if the people inside didn't give them what they wanted. Even today, modern witches still consider Halloween to be a very important day. Another explanation is related to the custom of having young boys go door to door with a bag in order to beg for materials to be burned in the bonfire. My favorite explanation lies in what the Celts called mumming. They would supply a table filled with food in an effort to attract the good spirits that roamed the earth that night. They believed that these good spirits were earthbound until they received the proper send-off made up of treats, possessions, wealth, food, or drink. And if these spirits weren't treated properly, they would play tricks on the people who had neglected them. Well, the spirits were then, who were determined to trick people were believed to assume grotesque shapes. And it was believed that wearing costumes that looked like them would confuse the spirits and they would leave. Others believed that the spirits could be discouraged by carving a grotesque face into a gourd or a root, and the Irish and the Scots used a turnip. The custom is what led to the jack-o'-lantern, and I'll explain that in a minute. Well, there was a danger in doing this. You see, if you were too nice to dead Uncle Harry, he might decide to stay. But at the same time, they felt that if they didn't treat these spirits well enough, they would hang around and trick them for revenge. So at the end of the night, villagers wearing masks and costumes to disguise their identity would parade to the edge of town carrying bags of candy in order to entice the spirits to leave. Now, like I said earlier, the best known symbol of Halloween is the jack-o'-lantern. Some people feel that the carved pumpkin may have originated with the idea that witches were supposed to use a skull with a candle inside of it to light the way to their coven meetings. Another explanation is that it came from the Druid practice of placing a glowing coal in a turnip or a potato that had been carved to look like a demon. They felt that this would frighten away the evil spirits. But since Halloween, as we know it, is predominantly an Irish custom, I tend to favor an old Irish folktale about Irish Jack. As the story goes, Irish Jack was a stingy old blacksmith who liked to drink a little bit too much. Well, one night when Jack was in the local pub, the devil came to take his soul. Well, Jack tricks the devil into having a drink with him before they go. Well, when it comes time to pay up, the devil doesn't have any money. So, in order to pay for his drink, the devil turns himself into a sixpence. Well, as soon as the devil does that, Jack grabs the coin and puts it in his wallet. It seems that Jack's wallet had a catch on it that resembled the shape of a cross, and this kept the devil trapped inside his wallet. Well, eventually Jack released the devil, but not before he had gotten the devil to promise to leave him alone for another year. After the year was up, the devil came again to take Jack's soul. But this time he tricks the devil into climbing up a tree to pick an apple. Then, as soon as the devil is up in the tree, Jack cuts the sign of the cross on the tree trunk, and the devil can't get down. All told, Jack tricked the devil 3 times. The last time, Jack made the devil promise that he would never come back to take his soul. Well, eventually Jack did die, so he goes to the gates of heaven, and they won't let him in because of his drunkenness and his selfish life. So he goes to see if the devil will take him in. But the devil wants no part of him. I mean, he's just too tricky. So in order to chase Jack away from the gates of hell, the devil throws a hot coal at him. Well, since Jack had no place to go, he's condemned to roam the earth until Judgment Day. And in order to light his way, he picks up the hot coal that the devil had thrown at him, and he puts it in a turnip that he happened to be eating at the time. And from that moment on, he has been wandering all over the earth carrying his jack-o'-lantern. Well, in the late 1800s, the Irish immigrants who came to America discovered the pumpkin, and they were a lot smaller than they are now. And since carving out a pumpkin and turning it into a lantern is a lot easier than turning a turnip into a lantern, the American version of the story turned the turnip into a pumpkin. Okay, so how did black cats become attached to Halloween? And how did they get their reputation for being evil? It would seem that the Druid festival to Samhain, the death god, was supposed to decide what kind of animal and the evil person would be turned into, and he was supposed to turn the very worst spirits into black cats. As a result, the Celts considered black cats to be the reincarnation of very evil people. So they were pictured in folklore as being the companions of witches, demons, and all sorts of evil beings. All right, next, let's look at some of the customs that involve fruits and nuts. Giving out fruits and nuts as treats isn't as prominent as it once was because they can be so easily contaminated. But I can still remember a time when various fruits and nuts were the treat of choice in most households. I'm that old, folks. And since Halloween occurs in the autumn, when apples were in season, apples seemed to be the fruit of choice. But originally, this practice was far more than simply an attempt to get kids to eat better food. Most of the fruit was used in those early Halloween activities were used in the occult practice of foretelling the future. Remember, the Druids worshipped nature, so they would use fruits, nuts, and vegetables to cast spells and foretell the future. Well, the three most prominent of these were the apple, because it was thought to be a love charm, the hazelnut, because it was considered to be a god, and the acorn, because it was associated with the oak tree, and the Druids worshipped the oak tree as a god. Did you know that the use of fruits and nuts to foretell the future became so common in America that Halloween was once known as Nutcracker Night? Young people would take a nut, which was supposed to represent their lover, and they would place it beside the fire and watch how it burned. If the nut burned wildly and unevenly, it meant that the lover was not going to be faithful. But if the nut burned with an even glow, it meant that the lover would turn out to be true. Well, if a young girl had to decide between two suitors, she would take two nuts, and she would give each one of them the name of one of her suitors. Then she would throw the nuts into the fire. If the nut burst open, it meant that the suitor would be an unfaithful lover. But if the nut burned with an even glow, it meant that the suitor was Mr. Right. I have no idea what they did if they both burned evenly.
Mormons.
But I don't think there were very many people who really took the thing very seriously anyway. They treated it more like a cute party game. As I said earlier, the Celts believed that the apple was a love charm, so they would use apples to foretell the future in much the same way that nuts were used. A young lady would take an apple, which was called a pippin, and she would peel it so that the peel came off in one continuous piece. Then, after she had twirled the piece over her head 3 times, she would toss it over her left shoulder. When it hit the floor, it was supposed to form the initial of the person that she was going to marry. Well, variations of this apple trick were developed over the years. Some people believe that if a girl would eat an apple while she was sitting in front of a mirror at midnight on Halloween, the image of her future husband would appear in the mirror. If no image appeared, it meant that she would be a spinster. And Scott said another variation of the apple in the mirror at midnight trick had required the girl to cut the apple into 9 pieces. Then she would pick up each piece of the apple with the end of a knife and she would eat it. When she had only 1 piece left, the image of her future husband would then appear in the mirror over her left shoulder and ask her for the last piece of apple. Now, bobbing for apples also came from the Roman custom, as it was used by the boys in much the same way that the apple was used by the girls. Apples were labeled with the name of potential mates, and then they were placed in a tub full of water. The guy was blindfolded, and with his hands held behind his back, he would try to capture an apple in his teeth. The one he caught bore the name of his future wife. And see, even the innocent party game of bobbing for apples has its root in the occult practice of fortune-telling. There was a children's book published a few years ago that gave all of the methods for predicting the future, as well as a few hundred more. For example, some people believe that if a person would eat the crust of a dry slice of bread before they went to bed on Halloween, their wish would come true. In North Wales, there was a custom that was supposed to predict who was going to die in the next year. Every family member would build their own Halloween bonfire, and these fires were called Coel Coeth. Then each member of the family would mark a white stone so that it would be identified later as belonging to them. Then they would throw the stone into the fire. The next morning, they would return to search through the ashes for the stones. If any of the stones were missing, it meant that the owner would die sometime during the coming year. The publisher of this book collected these customs along with many others and printed them as games to be played by teenagers at Halloween parties. And I'm sure that the publisher thought that this was all great fun. But you can't help but worry that these superstitions could work their way into the young people's mind and start to control what they do. Well, for the most part, Halloween, as is practiced today, is usually nothing more than innocent fun for the children. And there is an element found in this holiday that can be very dangerous, and that's especially true for young people. You see, Halloween is still taken very seriously by certain groups of people today. The Voodoo Museum in New Orleans usually offers a special Halloween ritual in which people can see real voodoo rituals being performed. In Salem, Massachusetts, they hold a Halloween festival that starts on October 13th and it runs through a Halloween night on October 31st. The festival usually includes a psychic fair. People in Florida love to ride through Cassadaga and visit the spiritists who live there. For the last few years, the town of Cassadaga has actually had to post police officers at the entrances to the town to turn people away. Of course, we all know that Halloween has always been associated with witches, and most people don't know this, but the practice of witchcraft is very widespread today. The modern manifestation of the old Druid religion of nature worship is called Wicca. Well, modern witches consider Halloween to be a very special day. In fact, they still call it Samhain. Halloween is one of the key days that they call Sabbats. And since the one on October 31st is the last one of the year, it's called the Grand Sabbat. For Wiccans, a Sabbat is a day when the walls of the separation of the physical world and the spiritual world are to be at their thinnest. These are the days when their charms, spells, and divinations are supposed to be the most powerful. The dates of these Sabbats will vary depending on the group that's holding them. But since Halloween is supposed to be the most important Sabbath of the year, all witches celebrate Halloween. The Grand Sabbath is supposed to be celebrated in honor of the dead. Some Wiccan witches even take off from work to celebrate that day. And some groups of witches have even petitioned local school boards to have the schools closed to commemorate their Grand Sabbath. In fact, I heard about one school board that had decided to ban the celebration of Halloween a few years ago because they were afraid that the local witches would be offended by having the kids playing during their Sabbat. Satanists are another group that consider Halloween to be an important day. They feel that Halloween is the only day of the year when Satan can be invoked to help out about future marriages, health, crops, and other events in the coming year. Now, even though modern-day witches say that they have great disdain for Satanists, there are enough similarities in the way both of these groups act to say that Satan is the force behind Satanism, witchcraft, and all forms of the occult. Another bit of the occult that people tend to take lightly today is the use of Ouija boards as party games at Halloween parties. The use of such boards can be very dangerous. You see, the real danger in Halloween comes when people start to use these occult methods to determine their marriage partner, their career path, or even matters of life or death. And at that point, Halloween stops being innocent fun and starts being a very dangerous holiday. The consequences that can occur in people's lives as a result of the occult practices are much more than simply parlor games. Well, so far in this lesson, we've examined the pagan elements that have been the historic part of the holiday. But do these pagan elements automatically disqualify Christians from having their Halloween parties? Now, because of the revival of many occult practices in America today, and because of the influence that these practices have had on society, I don't think that anyone would deny that Christians would be wise to question the advisability of allowing their children to dress up as genuine occult figures like witches, ghosts, devils, and wizards, or to dress up in a way that might dishonor our Lord. Being involved in the occult is not a harmless practice. Even so, I know of people right here in this church who will avoid Halloween like the plague, but then they'll sit down and they'll read their horoscope every day. And to associate our children with these things, even indirectly, as the name of fun, is probably not a wise thing to do. You don't want to leave a young child with the impression that witches and devils are only cute cartoon characters and a Ouija board is only a party game. On the other hand, the customs surrounding Halloween today aren't alone when you look at pagan influences. Remnants of paganism can be found in many American holiday celebrations today. And it would be hard to tell people not to participate in them just because they have pagan roots. I mean, after all, most people don't even know about the pagan remnants that are found in most of these holidays. And even if they do, they don't carry the same meaning that they once did. The early Christians never celebrated the birth of Christ. I mean, after all, we're Easter people. But the early church saw a problem. One of the Roman holidays that the church wanted to Christianize was called Saturnalia, and celebrated the god Saturn. Saturnalia covered a 7-day period from December 17th to December 24th. Well, the day after Saturnalia was dedicated to the birth of the Roman god Mithras. Mithras was the god of light and truth. He was supposed to have been born out of a rock, and he was always pictured killing the sacred bull in order to give birth to the earth. So December 25th was known as the celebration for the birth of the unconquered sun. So the church decided to give Christians a Christian reason to celebrate on that day. So instead of celebrating the birth of the unconquered sun, Mithras, on December 25th, Christians were going to celebrate the birth of Christ. And the fact is, Jesus was probably born in the spring and not in the dead of winter. So celebrating the birth of Christ on December 25th actually started out as a pagan holiday in much the same way that Halloween did. Many of the customs surrounding Christmas and Easter can trace their roots to pagan customs that were Christianized, and the same thing can be said about many of the customs surrounding Halloween. For example, the name Easter comes from the name of the fertility goddess Ishtar. And let's not forget the pagan symbols of fertility, decorated eggs and Easter bunnies. The Christmas tree originated in the ancient European idea that the evergreen tree embodied powerful spirits, and that you could appropriate the power of these earth spirits by bringing the tree into your house and decorating it. But Martin Luther decided to depaganize this custom by giving it a Christian meaning. The practice of sending Valentine's Day cards goes all the way back to the Roman fertility festival of Lupercalia. The custom of kissing under the mistletoe came by tracing back to the Druids, who thought that doing that would increase a person's sexual potency. Many pagan fertility rites and sacrifices were also associated with mistletoe. Well, our custom of birthday cakes probably originated with the worship of Artemis, the Greek god of the moon, goddess of the moon. People who worshipped Artemis would offer cakes to the goddess every year on their birthday, and they would put one candle in the cake for each year they had lived. The custom of passing out cigars and the birth of a baby is probably a carryover from the ancient Mayan custom of blowing a tobacco smoke toward the sun god as an offering to thanks for the child. The month of June seems to be a popular time to get married. Well, the idea of June brides goes all the way back to the worship of the Roman goddess of childbirth, Juno. So she was the female equivalent of the god Jupiter, and she presided over that month. The fact is, most of the elements associated with American weddings can be traced back to pagan customs. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, for a successful marriage. And let's not forget tossing the bouquet and the garter to see who's going to get married next. That's telling the future. Right? Does that mean that we should stop having weddings because of the pagan elements that we find there? I don't think so. Should we stop having Christmas trees because they were once pagan symbols? Should we stop eating apples because the Druids considered them to be love charms and they could use to predict the future? Even the days of the week are named after pagan gods. One day is Moon Day. Tuesday is Zeus Day. You see, the Latin spelling for the name Zeus is T-U-E-S. Wednesday is named after Woden, the Viking god of war. Thursday is Thor's day, the god of thunder. He's a Viking god. Friday is named after Woden's wife, Frigga. Saturday is dedicated to the Roman god of fertility and agriculture, Saturn. And Sunday is dedicated to the sun god. You see, just because we can still trace the pagan roots of these things, the pagan meanings and practices that were once associated with Christmas, Easter, Valentine's Day, weddings, and other things have long vanished. So I don't think anyone would argue that we should stop celebrating Christmas because December 25th was once the pagan holiday of Saturnalia and the birth of the unconquered sun Mithras. Or that Christmas has now been turned into a secular holiday or winter break by many of our school districts today. And the focus of Christmas is now Santa Claus rather than Christ. Now, just as a footnote here, Christians tend to get all upset when they see the word Xmas substituted for the word Christmas. They think that this is an attempt to remove Christ from the celebration of Christmas. Well, I'm sorry to tell you this, but that is simply not true. You see, the word Christmas is a compound word that's made up of the words Christ and Mass. Well, the Greek word for Christ is Christos. And when you write the word in Greek, the first letter of that word is chi. Well, the Greek letter chi happens to look exactly like the English letter X. So in the days before the printing presses, in order to save time and ink, the scribes would very often use the Greek letter chi as an abbreviation for the word Christ. So Xmas is a legitimate abbreviation for the word Christmas, and it has been used for centuries. Well, even though Halloween has pagan roots, how people use the holiday should determine our attitude toward how it's done and not its history. For the most part, Halloween today has become a purely secular pastime that can be engaged in without any occult association whatsoever. Now, if we're living back in the 1940s and 50s, when the world of the occult was largely hidden from public view, and Halloween was a far more innocent holiday than it is today, we probably wouldn't need to have a Sunday school lesson about it. But since the occult practices associated with Halloween have become so open today, Christians are beginning to wonder if it's still acceptable for them to participate in it. Well, the first thing that we need to remember is that the occult activities that have always been associated with Halloween are still, for the most part, far removed from the mainstream celebration of that holiday today. So no one needs to be concerned that they might be supporting the occult just because they dress up their child in a bunny costume and take them out trick-or-treating for candy. Any real occult activities that may be associated with Halloween can be very easily avoided. But if you find out that your child's teacher is studying the occult in order to understand the history of Halloween, or if your child's school is having a Wiccan witch come in as a guest speaker in order to show the students how other people view Halloween, or if they are in any way trying to encourage the students into occult and New Age practices, we should oppose it. And some school districts are doing that by saying that all they're trying to do is lessen the importance of avoiding such things and encouraging the students to be curious about them. Then you have the legal right to remove your child from those activities, and you should. Secondly, as Christians, we need to be carefully evaluate the activities that we're going to participate in, or allow our children to participate in, or grandchildren. We also need to respect the varying views of other Christians that they have about Halloween. Even if we have determined that a particular activity is harmless for us, if someone else feels that it might hurt them, we need to respect their position and not expose them to that temptation. In other words, if you were to invite another Christian family into your home on Halloween and you know that they don't feel that it's right to participate in any Halloween activities, sending your kids out to trick-or-treat and then encouraging their kids to join in isn't the best thing to do. I mean, after all, you might be dealing with someone who has been saved out of some sort of real occult activity, and for them to even acknowledge Halloween would bring back some very bad memories for them. It would be the same as showing a documentary film of the Nazi death camps of someone who lived through the Holocaust. Paul was confronted with a similar situation with the conflict that arose in the church about eating meat that had been offered to idols. He knew that there was no spiritual significance in eating that meat, I mean, meat is meat, whether it was offered to an idol or not. But he also recognized the fact that for the people who had worshipped those idols before they were saved, eating that meat carried great significance for them. So he respected their feelings, and he didn't eat the meat when he was around them. You see, if we do something that might cause a weaker brother or sister to fall, even though that activity wouldn't harm us personally, we still shouldn't do it for their sake. So whenever we're considering a particular Halloween activity, we need to think about who is going to be there with us, and then take into consideration what their feelings are concerning that holiday. Paul wrote this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, "All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any questions on the grounds of conscience. But if someone says to you, 'This has been offered in sacrifice,' then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you, and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his." Romans chapter 14, he said, "As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but do not quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weaker person eats only vegetables. One person esteems the day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. Therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother." So, how does this all relate to Christians' response to Halloween? Simple. Whenever a person feels that his conscience has been violated by some activity relating to Halloween, no one should look down on him because he refuses to participate. In other words, let them be the judge and respect how they feel. Simply put, anyone who participates in Halloween should not condemn the person who doesn't want to participate. Likewise, the man who does not participate shouldn't condemn the man who does. But, with a big capital B-U-T, whenever those Halloween activities involve things that are genuinely occult, the Bible very clearly teaches that we should avoid them. Leviticus 19:31 says, "Do not turn to mediums or necromancers. Do not seek them out or so make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord your God." That is not a suggestion, that is a command. Moses wrote this in the book of Deuteronomy. "There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering, anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes or interprets omens, or a sorcerer or a charmer or a medium or a necromancer or one who inquires of the dead. For these nations which you are about to dispossess, listen to fortune tellers and to diviners, but as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do this." So stop reading horoscopes if you're doing it, okay? Nowhere in the Bible are we ever told that those sort of activities are acceptable behavior for God's people. So truly occult activities, and I have to say it again, truly occult activities should be avoided at all costs. Now, obviously, the best way to avoid any of the controversy surrounding Halloween is to just not participate in any Halloween activities at all. Paul said, "But test everything, hold fast what is good, abstain from every form of evil." What do you do with Halloween? What you do with Halloween depends on your spiritual maturity as well as the maturity of those who are around you. So how you approach Halloween is really a personal decision. If you'd be tempted to let Halloween become more than just an innocent celebration of costumes and candy, avoid it. Now let's look at some of the alternatives to Halloween. There are many positive alternatives to Halloween that won't allow us to have the time to cover all of them, but here are a few. Now please understand this. As long as the parents are careful about the choice of costumes, there's no reason that a child can't take part in the traditional American activity of Halloween, like trick-or-treating or Halloween parties. Also, no child should ever feel left out because the parents don't want him to participate in those traditional activities. Many churches are now offering alternatives such as carnivals and youth parties. Some families plan Halloween as a family night out, so they won't need to participate in the trick-or-treat activities that the other families in the neighborhood are taking part in. Halloween can also be turned into a family get-together for parties or games at home. Whether they include costumes is strictly up to you, as long as the costumes are appropriate. You should avoid occult figures like devils, witches, sorcerers, black cats, and so on. Why not dress up as people from the Bible? How about animals that are that aren't associated with the occult, like dogs, cats, lions, tigers, so forth? Or characters from American history and church history. There's tons of cartoon characters to choose from. How about dressing up like people from everyday life, like firemen, policemen, cowboys, ballerinas, hobos? Party games are okay too, but avoid Ouija boards, fortune-telling games, or anything that's genuinely occult in nature. If you want to carve a pumpkin into a jack-o'-lantern, fine. Just don't give it a grotesque face. Give it a happy face. You might also want to include a prayer time in your Halloween party. You can ask the children to pray for the people who are genuinely involved in the occult, so they can see the error of their ways. You can also pray that God will stop the occult revival in America. For those trick-or-treaters that do show up at your door, in addition to traditional candy, why not give them a Bible tract dealing with salvation? Now, don't forget, for very young children, Halloween can be a very frightening time. After seeing all those costumes, they may go to bed with visions of monsters in every corner. Even when it's their own parents who are putting on those scary masks, they can still be frightening for a young child. So in most cases, the last thing you want to do is take a 3 or 4-year-old out trick-or-treating when the streets are filled with those scary costumes, until you can be sure that they understand that they are just costumes and not real beings. And you definitely want to avoid those Halloween haunted houses. I don't think I will ever understand why people want to pay good money to go to these places and be scared out of their shorts. Does it make sense? No. I mean, but if that's what paddles your canoe, go ahead and do it. I don't care. Just leave children out of it. Parents need to take their child's fears very seriously and do whatever they can do to protect them until they can better understand what's going on. And never tell them that their fear is foolish. And if the child gets frightened, it's not a good idea to tell them that demons and devils aren't real, because they are. Since the Bible speaks of the devil and demons, if you tell a child that they aren't real, why should they believe you when you tell them that Jesus is real? So it is a good idea to assure the children that they don't have to be afraid of ghosts or devils, because they have Jesus to protect them. Unfortunately, the same scenario is true of Santa Claus. You see, Santa and Jesus have a lot of similar characteristics. Santa does nice things for people. He never does anything wrong. He seems to be omniscient because he knows what everyone wants, and he also knows who's naughty and nice. And he has the ability to go anywhere he wants to. Then, after about 5 or 6 years, you finally tell the child that you've been lying to them for all that time, and Santa really isn't real. Then you expect them to believe you when you tell them that the truth about Jesus is real. Why not tell the child right up front that Santa is a make-believe character that represents all the good things about Christmas, and let's have fun with the story. But at the same time, don't forget to tell them that Christmas is the celebration of the birth of our Savior. And in his case, we don't have to pretend, because he is real. Well, back to Halloween. The point of this lesson is Halloween can be a fun time as well as a productive time for God's people. You just need to handle it properly. How innocent Halloween is strictly up to the individual. All it takes is prayer, Bible study, so that you know what is acceptable and what isn't, and a whole lot of good old common sense.